I'm Larry Cordray. I'm a member of the Fairfield Friends Meeting, and it's been my pleasure to introduce Max to you all this evening. Max grew up on a dairy farm outside of Roosevelt, Indiana, descended from nearly a dozen generations of Quakers on both sides of his family. He claims that his family tree is a trunk and that his gene pool is very shallow. He was an active member of the Roosevelt Friends Meeting, Western Yearly Meeting. After high school, he attended Ball State, majoring in German and mathematics, and active in the Indiana Yearly Meeting, a Ball State Fellowship of Friends. Among his other claims is that the main thing he got out of Ball State was a lifelong friendship with his roomie of 2 years, me. A conscientious objector, Max performed his alternative service, teaching from 1970 to 1972 at the French Boys School in Ramallah, Palestine, establishing a lifelong interest in the Middle East. He and his wife led annual service learning trips to Palestine and Israel to volunteer at the Friends School and introduce people to the situation. Following his alternative service, Max earned a degree in campus ministry from the Earlham School of Religion, met his wife Jane at Earlham, and served on the staff at Earlham for 9 years. His next stop with his family was PhD work at Temple University in American Religious History and Teaching at 2 Quaker secondary schools in Philadelphia. In 1990, Max accepted the position of campus ministry coordinator. Can't read. Where he spent the last 25 years of his 45 years in Quaker education, retiring in 2015 as the William R. Rogers Director of Friends Center and Quaker Studies. He and his wife Jane still live in Greensboro, where they are members of the New Garden Friends Meeting, North Carolina Fellowship of Friends. They have 3 children, all married and proud parents of Jane and Max's 7 grandchildren. In retirement, Max serves on numerous Quaker boards, volunteers teaching in several adult continuing education programs, and enjoys giving historical tours around Quaker, North Carolina. Among his publications are Spirits 1 and 2, Palestine and Israel, A Personal Encounter, Tales from the New Garden Friends Graveyard, and 2 forthcoming books through Barclay Press and Friends United Press, a sequel to Palestine and Israel, and a biography with 2 of his cousins of his great aunt, Annis Carter, a Quaker missionary in Palestine and Kenya. It's all yours, Max.
Thanks much, Larry. And I'm serious that one of the best things I got out of Ball State was 2 years of rooming with Larry. That was a real delight. And thanks much for that eulogy. I had seeing Phil Gully's picture up there. I do have to say that if you read, I think it was his 2nd book in his series of Front Porch Tales and Hometown Tales, he has a chapter on Aunt Annis, and it's a delight to read. So I encourage you to read that, and forgive Phil for mistaking an Israeli Jeep for an army tank. She shooed away a Jeep full of soldiers, not an army tank. But other than that, it's a good chapter. Well, delighted to be with you. I'm surprised that on a Thursday night football night, there are this many people registered. And we have an hour, as I understand it, to cover the entire history of the origins of Quakerism, a topic that literally there was a course at Guilford College that took a whole semester to cover. So we're only going to be able to do the reduced Shakespeare version, the Reader's Digest condensed version of this history. And I'm sure it will leave lots of questions for you. Tomorrow, by email, you'll receive a reading list. I expect you to read it all. For those of you who want more detail, more information, that will be available. And I have to say, when I was at Earlham, I took a course with Hugh Barber on Quaker history. And if any of you know Hugh Barber, it's true. All the stories you've heard are true. The first day of class, he handed out a syllabus, and we were looking through this thing, and one student very querulously said, "Hugh, how do you expect us to read all of this in just one semester?" And he looked genuinely puzzled and said, "This is the first week." True. Anyway, we'll try to cover as much as we can about the origins of Quakerism and try to leave some time at the end of this hour for questions as well. I trust that you'll receive my email along with this reading list tomorrow. So please feel free to email me with any questions, comments, or corrections. I want to start off by telling a little story about one of the incidents in George Fox's life. In 1652, just after he left prison, his first imprisonment for blasphemy, for claiming that Christ dwelled within him, he was making his way towards the north of England and came within sight of the Cathedral of Lichfield in the Midlands, a famous three-spired cathedral, very unusual architecture for England. And in his journal, he says that when he saw the spires of the Lichfield Cathedral, it struck at his heart so that he took his sandals off, handed them to a shepherd, and then wandered the streets of Lichfield for 2 hours, crying, "Woe to you, bloody city of Lichfield," came back out, paid the shepherd a groat or two, and put his sandals back on, but actually then took them off again because his feet were burning so hot from the experience. Now, many scholars and psychologists have tried to unpack that odd experience of Fox's. And believe me, it's one of the least odd experiences of early friends. We'll get to folk wandering around naked with baskets of burning coals on their heads later. But in 1999, when I was on sabbatical in England, I had an opportunity to take the train from Woodbrook, the Quaker Study Center in Birmingham, to Lichfield. And it just so happened that there was a display about the Civil War, the English Civil War. Those of us in the South know that the Civil War still isn't over in the South, and it is even more so true in England. The English Civil War had a very deep impact still on England. And in that display was a picture of the Lichfield Cathedral in the late 1640s, one of those spires having been destroyed in the battle between the forces of Parliament and the forces of the king in the English Civil War. And that's when I understood what had hit so hard on George Fox. Here were two Christian armies having at each other, and their cannon fire having destroyed one of those three spires. And it wasn't seeing three spires of this cathedral that hit him so hard. It was seeing a destroyed spire caused by two Christian armies fighting each other. We'll start unpacking that as we take a look at the origins of Quakerism. But if you explore any of the traditions that come out of the Radical Reformation or the Spiritual Reformation in England during the Civil War period, you know, the Anabaptists, the Amish, the Hutterites, the Mennonites, the Brethren, you will find that the notion of Christians fighting was one of the elements that led them to leave the established church or even the Reformed churches. So bear that one in mind. So now we go into the Civil War period, out of which Quakerism emerged. This is a time of questions of by what authority do we organize our political life, our religious life, our economic life, and our social life? It was on during the 1640s. A good sign of the questioning of authority during that period is that in 1649, they lopped off the head of their king. Now, there's a statement about authority if ever there was one. And it's interesting to note that Quakerism began under Charles I. Later on, we'll see how it was challenged by the restoration of the throne in 1660 with Charles II. We are now entering into the reign of Charles III. So what might that portend for Quakerism? We began under the Charles I and II. Let's hope we don't end under Charles III. To give some sense of what some of the motivations for the beginnings of Quakerism are, we usually go back to George Fox. Now, George Fox was only one of several founders of Quakerism because he left a journal. We have some evidence of his motivations and his articulation of the beginnings of Quakerism, but he was among others who were questioning the authority of the church, the authority of the king, the authority of the culture of the time. But he is a good example of what some of those issues were. And if any of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell and the power of myth, you may be familiar with a constant theme that he articulated in world religions, the world's wisdom traditions, of the hero's journey, of Moses going out into the wilderness and having an experience of God, of the Buddha leaving his wealth and privilege, going out into the wilderness and having an experience of enlightenment, of Muhammad going out into the wilderness, having the revelation of the Quran, of Jesus going out into the wilderness. I mean, this is a theme, and I don't want to equate George with any of those folks, but he had that same sort of pilgrimage. Growing up in the Church of England, as a young person, he began to be very disturbed by the hypocrisy and lack of integrity he saw among those in his church who proclaimed all the creeds of the church, all the prayers of the church on Sunday, and then went out in the village the rest of the week behaving however they darn well wanted to. And so at a young age, he left all of that and went on that hero's journey, seeking for an experience of truth. What was really true? What could he experience spiritually that he couldn't deny? That was absolutely true. True enough that if someone said, okay, I've got the truth over here and I'll perform a whole bunch of miracles to prove it, he would still know internally he knew the truth. And in this journey, which was several years long, he confided in priests, in professors, those professed religion, and scholars. Every so often got some helpful hints, but nothing that really spoke to his condition. He would hold himself up in a hollow tree and read his Bible for days on end so that he knew the Bible backwards and forwards. It was said of George Fox that if all the copies of the Bible were lost, he could recreate it from his own memory. But he said it was just dust in his mouth. It still wasn't the living experience that he was seeking. And then in 1647, in his journal, he says, when all my hope in all things, all institutions, all professors was gone, so that there was nothing outwardly to help me, I heard a voice that said, there is one, even Christ Jesus, who can speak to thy condition. And my heart did leap for joy. Now that's 1647 language. In 2022, we would probably interpret that to say what he had been seeking outside of himself through other people's experience and knowledge and authority, he discovered that was inside of him, that there was something within him. She named Christ Jesus that could speak to his condition, that could lead him into truth. Now, this is not unique to Quaker spirituality and mysticism. In the mystical branch of every religion around, you can find something similar. Brahman is Atman. There's that near you which will guide you. Allah is as close as your jugular vein. We have this understanding in all the world's wisdom traditions, that that which we believe to be transcendent is also immanent. And in his Christian upbringing and education, Fox equated that with Christ Jesus. And you'll see later with Robert Barclay and other early Quakers' understanding and articulation of that theologically, that was not particular to the name Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was the name given the power that resides in all of us. And they often cited the Gospel of John, of course, John 1:9, that light which enlightens everyone. And later on, Robert Barclay, first generation Quaker, in his apology, his theological work, said, those who turn to that light within them, that of Christ, the seed, it was experiential religion. The Quakers had a whole variety of names for it, that of God, the seed, the light, the bread of life, the word. If they turned to that power within them, they would be led into truth, into salvation, even if they'd never heard the name Jesus Christ. So that was not overly popular with the Puritans of the time, but it was essential to an understanding of where Quakers saw authority coming from. It wasn't from creeds and rites, rituals, the Book of Common Prayer, the ordained clergy, the church, or even the Bible. Authority primarily came from the author of Scripture, the author, Christ, God, the light within. So that's an important understanding of that early Quaker opening of Fox's and others. Now, I don't want you to think that that arrived at creatio ex nihilo, or Venus on the half shell, descending from heaven. There were other streams of influence that set the groundwork for Fox's experience. And I want to talk about some of those streams of influence that influenced early Quakerism and still do today. Next week, in our second session, we'll look at the spiritual and social testimonies that emerged out of these early Quaker experiences, and many of them rooted in these other streams of influence. So I want to go into those now. The first of those would be the Seekers. Seekers were a distinct group of people, Seekers 1 and Seekers 2, if you read Ben Pink Dandelion's writings. There were those within the Church of England who were seeking to reform it from within. And the Puritans were among those. They had found, like Fox had, that there was something missing in connecting the spirituality of Christianity with actual behavior. And many of those were among the folk who felt that when Henry VIII decided to form his own church so he could get divorced, that was probably not the extent of reform that they were hoping for. There was more. And they took their cues from the reform movement over on the continent. Calvin, Zwingli, Eckles, Luther, and the Geneva folk. And so they were wanting a more thoroughgoing Reformation like that, and not just Catholic light that Henry VIII had introduced in the Church of England. So there were those seekers within the church seeking to reform it from within. Then there were seekers too, as Ben Pink Dandelion articulates it, those who said, it's a dead corpse, you can't beat the horse anymore, we're out of here. And they sought a deeper spiritual understanding, kind of like Fox did, leaving the church and going on spiritual pilgrimage. And these were the folk who formed those conventicles, those chapels. Eventually you saw, the Methodists and the other separatists, the nonconformists, who left the established church and met in each other's homes to study the Bible, to, in fact, study the Bible, settle into silence, and expect the Holy Spirit to interpret for them, rather than ordained clergy and the folk who'd been educated at Oxford and Cambridge. So there were these groups already out and about in England. So that's one stream, these seekers, these nonconformists. A second were the restorationists. Now we'll talk about the 1660 restoration, the restoration of the crown after the interregnum. That's not the restorationism I'm talking about. The restorationist movement is linked more to the radical Reformation of the 1520s. I see someone here from Reba Place, they know all about this, Brethren and Mennonites and all that good theology of the radical Reformation and Anabaptism, that the reformers hadn't gone far enough. Luther still had a church and state in bed together. He was still baptizing infants. He was still celebrating the Mass. He was still using violence. He joined up with the Catholic Church to wipe out the peasants in the peasant revolt. And the Anabaptists, the radical reformers, especially after 1525, said, we've got to restore original Christianity. We've got to go back beyond beliefism to the actual ethics and teachings of Jesus, back past the church councils, back past the theologians, back to the Sermon on the Mount, and restore original Christianity. The guidelines of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. It was very key in this. And here, again, you see a strong hint of the influence of that restorationist movement on Quakerism, because their original name wasn't Quakers. It wasn't the Religious Society of Friends. It wasn't those wackos down in Canby. It was Primitive Christianity Restored, or Primitive Christianity Revived, or Children of the Light, Publishers of Truth, an experiential name that came out of their experience of the light and their desire to restore the purity of that original Christianity. So that's a second stream of important influence, the restorationist movement. They got their cues again from those continental radical reformers. Even though there was no physical tie to them, there was certainly a spiritual tie. A third stream of influence was apocalypticism. We're living in apocalyptic times now, where people are looking for signs and portents, and politically, socially, religiously, and those of us of a certain age, and I see from the the people who have logged on, many of us remember the 60s, especially those of us who were raised in Western early meeting and didn't drink and do drugs. We lived through the 60s and can remember it. The late great Planet Earth, Hal Lindsey, Satan's Alive and Well on Planet Earth, all these apocalyptic books. And I just love the fact that Hal Lindsey made millions of dollars off these books predicting the imminent end of the world with Christ descending, and invested in long-term real estate bonds. I just love that. But anyway, we know there have been these apocalyptic times before. The 60s were an apocalyptic time. earthquakes, tornadoes. Those of us who lived through April 11, 1965, the Palm City tornadoes in Indiana know that there was sermon after sermon after sermon after that of, sign of the times, war, the pillars of society in the 60s were being upset. Ball State from 67 to 68, they unlocked the women's dorms and they didn't have to go back to their dorm at 9:30 at night. I mean, all of the things that ordered our civilization were being upset. And a lot of people saying, okay, this is it. This is it. Well, we're in a time like that now. I mean, how many people have you heard saying, oh, Christ must be coming soon because look at all this wars and rumors of wars and all the sin and immorality and all the stuff happening, all the physical thing, climate change and hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and floods and pestilence. Well, imagine 1640s. They've lopped off the head of their king. There are all these crazy groups running amok and people questioning the authority, and the pillars of society are being turned upside down. One of the great historical books about that era, Christopher Hill's book, The World Turned Upside Down, about the English Civil War period. Well, in those sorts of times, people are looking, for Christ to return or an end of the world. And there were those apocalyptic movements at the time. And Quakers were apocalyptic also because they had experienced Christ coming within. So they were an interesting apocalyptic group because they believed that the second coming had already happened because Christ had come as that light within. This is why you get James Naylor making a big mistake trying to represent that symbolically in 1656. So he hopped on the back of a horse because he didn't want to imitate Jesus on the back of a donkey and rode into the city of Bristol, England, with followers shouting, Hosanna, blessed be the one who comes in the name of the Lord, and waving branches and stuff. Again, Parliament didn't like that very much. It didn't go well for James Naylor, but he was symbolically trying, Quakers should never play around with symbols, but he was trying to symbolically show Christ has entered our own hearts. Christ has entered our own lives. And that is the author of our salvation. That is our high priest, our king, our savior, our Lord, our teacher. And Earlham School of Religion was founded in 1660. The tagline for ESR for many, many years was, we hold that Christ is present, leading, guiding, and directing, and Christ's will may be known. Radical apocalypticism, Christ is present. So that has a tremendous impact too. This is how you can explain to your Protestant friends who think we're not Christians because we don't baptize or serve outward communion, that if Christ is present, you don't have to do this in remembrance of me. I'm here. Christ is present, the bread of life. So you don't need a symbolic act. Christ is present, the real presence. This is where Quakers and Catholics get mighty close together. So communion for an apocalyptic group is communion with that light, with that bread of life, with the presence of Christ among us. And you don't have to be baptized outwardly because you've been baptized inwardly. You have been washed inwardly and transformed inwardly by the presence of Christ, who, again, wasn't regarded by those early friends as some resident of a remoter star, but as present, leading, guiding, and directing. Thus, that famous Doyle Penrose painting you've got somewhere at Fairfield, I'm sure, the presence in the midst. As Quakers settle into worship, hovering above the facing bench is that ghostly figure of Jesus. That is the high priest, the author, the authority, and present in worship. So that apocalyptic element was another stream of deep influence on early Quakers. A fourth one was radicalism. Again, during the Civil War period, you've got folk beginning to question all the aspects of society, and the roots of our American democracy, which is hanging by a slender thread, are rooted in a lot of the themes of that Civil War period. You know, the rights of the commonest he and she in the realm. Who has the right to graze their sheep on the common green? Who has the right to read the Bible on their own? Who has the right to live a good life in a class society? And there were a number of groups questioning all of these social pillars of class society, of authority. One was the Levelers, a group that sought to level all the distinctions in society. They didn't respect all this English class society. And we've just come out of this whole funeral thing in England, and you saw it on in real time. The layers, even today, of class society, of the royals and all of that, as my great aunt Annis would say, falderall. Imagine what it was like in the 1640s and 50s. You were born into a class. You were born into the manor, to the manor born, M-A-N-O-R. And the Levelers said, no, we're going to level all these distinctions. And again, you see that influence on the Quakers. We wouldn't say you to a singular person. You did that to folk above you in class back then, because you was plural. Said thee, thou, and thy to your equals or inferiors. The Quaker said, it's thee, thou, and thy to everyone. You take your hat off, you curtsy, you bow to those above you. We've seen that again acted out in the funerals and all of that. Of course, I know the hats stay on the head. We take our hats off only to God. And into Quaker quietist culture, well, in some places into the 1900s, Quakers wore their hats into meeting for worship and took them off only when someone rose or knelt to address God, because God was speaking through them, and in a sign of their humility before God speaking, the hats would come off. In some cases, you would turn your back to the speaker and bow in humility. The Diggers, another one of these radical groups, who were peasants, who supposedly, in some of the rules and regulations worked out in English society, had common greens where they could graze their animals and raise some vegetables, but the gentry, you know, the folk above them in class, had confiscated those lands, had absconded with those common greens. And so at night, you know, urban gardeners, they would go out and dig up the greens and plant vegetables. A radical act of planting vegetables. The Diggers, an actual group. And again, those of you who were Grateful Dead fans know that among those who followed the Grateful Dead around was a group called the Diggers back in the day, getting their hint from those radicals of the English Civil War period. They're the fifth monarchists who believed they could bring in the reign of God through violence. There were any number of these groups, Muggletonians were another, who were questioning authority, questioning class, questioning all those things that disadvantaged the marginalized and the low lives. And there again, in Quakerism, you see the lingering impact of all of that. The testimony of equality, you know, for the longest time, are thee, thou, and thys. The way we make decisions, everyone has to agree. Radical democracy. One of Christopher Hill's students, Barry Ray, another historian of the Civil War period, said, if you want to understand the themes and issues of the English Civil War period, attend a Quaker business meeting. Now, I don't know if a modern day Quaker business meeting would necessarily display everything that he felt, would be displayed, a leaderless decision-making, voteless decision-making. But all those elements are there in how we do business. The clerk has the least power of anyone in a Quaker business meeting. And there's no decision made until everyone can agree or agree to disagree. The last stream of influence is when it's a bit harder to articulate, and that's why tomorrow you'll get a link to an essay I wrote way back in the day. And this is spiritual alchemy. At the time that Quakerism was arising in England, there was a restoration, a renewal of Paracelsianism. Now, my guess is if we take a show of hands of the 200 and some people here, I won't see very many who say, oh yeah, Paracelsus, I know him. Wasn't that Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, the old German alchemist? Probably not. But Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim had a moniker, Paracelsus. You can probably understand why. And Paracelsianism was, the Hermetic tradition, the alchemical tradition, that we can find that philosopher's stone. We can uncover the mystery of the universe. We can figure out how God created things. And if we unlock that mystery, we can turn lead into gold, because the natural processes of the earth, are simply, metals gestating in the womb of the earth, and over time they become, precious metals. But all of that alchemical understanding, which if you're of a certain age, you remember from Walt Disney's The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which scared the dickens out of me when I was a kid, was a symbol for an internal process. Paracelsianism, alchemy, was really a spiritual process. It used outward elements like lead and gold and silver and mercury to symbolize inward process. How do we turn our inward leaden nature into golden perfection? And if you read the alchemical texts and the English Paracelsians of the 1640s and 50s, when this was a major movement in England, it's a lot of Quaker language that we would recognize. The power of light, the power of burning away the dross, of taking that crucible and the refiner's fire, and the power of that fire and light to burn away the dross and reveal truth, or the gold or the silver. It was a time of questioning all the ancient authorities, and the alchemists, the Paracelsians, said, toss that dusty old authority out, go into the laboratory and experiment for yourself. This is where a modern science comes from. Go in and experiment for yourself. And what is Quakerism but an experiential faith? But you read the Paracelsian and alchemical texts, and you'll recognize an awful lot of common vocabulary with Quakerism. Direct and immediate access to truth, to your own experience, the power of light, the questioning of old authorities. And I'm convinced, and I hope you'll get some chuckles out of that article, at least as I try to articulate all of this in Early Friends in Spiritual Alchemy. But again, today, what is the tagline for the Friends Committee on National Legislation? We seek an earth restored. What's the alchemical process? It's returning to, it's a regressus ad uterum. It's return to the purity of the garden. It's a restoration of purity, of wholeness. We seek an earth restored. There's still that element of Quaker insistence on it's possible to perfect our lives. And early friends believed they could achieve that kind of wholeness, that kind of perfection. One of the books I recommend tomorrow is Rosemary Moore's The Light in Their Consciences, in which she looks at all these essays written by Quakers in the early 1650s, late 1640s, early 1650s, said they believed that they could become perfect. Now, it's not in the same way that Larry may remember this. My first roommate, this is why I went running to the warm embrace of my sophomore roomie, Larry Cordray, because my first roommate, Alan Wood, was from the Pilgrim Holiness denomination, which believed if you've been saved, had that first act of grace, there's a second act of grace that would follow, and you'd be sanctified, and all sin would be removed, and you'd be perfect. And I said, you know, Alan, I've never met anyone who's perfect. What do you mean? He said, I could kill you in cold blood right now, and I would still go to heaven because all sin's been removed. I slept with one eye open the rest of that semester at Ball State. But that's not the understanding early Quakers had. It was that you could live up to the light you'd been given, live up to the power of that light within to remove sin and darkness, and more would be given. It was a lifelong process of working out your salvation with fear and trembling, towards wholeness, rather than an instantaneous second act of grace that removed all sin. That's where we got into trouble in the 1870s and 80s in Quakerism. The Wesleyan influence came in, and that replaced the earlier Quaker understanding of perfection and wholeness. We'll get into that in 3 or 4 sessions. So again, there are at least these 5 streams of influence that affected the Christian culture of the time that George Fox would have swum in. To read George Fox's journal, all this was original to him. No, he was deeply influenced like anyone else would have been swimming in that culture. So out of all of this, you get the beginnings of Quaker. But other people, Elizabeth Houghton, Margaret Fell, James Naylor, others were coming to their own understandings of this as they left the New Model Army, as they participated in the Civil War and said, you know, there's got to be a better way. And were seekers, came out of those seekers groups and other nonconformist groups, and found in Fox's articulation and Naylor's articulation, other of the early Quakers' articulation, that this was what they had been seeking, this kind of spirituality, this kind of understanding of the Christian walk. But again, following George Fox, he's preaching this kind of direct experience. He's clapped in jail in the early 1650s because the Puritans are not amused by this. Again, Puritan, Calvinistic theologies that were all loathsome insects dangling by a slender thread over the very pits of hell. And here's Fox saying, Christ dwells within you. So you're a temple. You're a temple. And if you read any of some of the women's writings, and I include that in some of the reading list, the women are all about this because women's bodies were seen as gardens of temptation. This is one of the reasons that women were so left out of authority in the church, that women's bodies especially were corrupt and temptresses. And here's this religion said, God dwells in all of us equally, men and women, educated, not educated. And so the women flocked to this movement. And there's some wonderful reading about celestial flesh and Christopresentism that some modern women Quaker scholars have been writing about. So Fox gets clapped in jail for blasphemy, for claiming that Christ dwells within him. And as he is being condemned to jail, the judge orders him to tremble before the authority of the court. And Fox responds, no, it's thou, O judge, who ought tremble and quake before the authority of the Almighty. And that's where we got the name of Quakers. The judge said, what? Art thou some sort of a Quaker? Some sort of rabble-rousing enthusiast, some sort of Pentecostal snake handler. And that's where we got the term Quaker as a pejorative term. And so, Quakers named it and claimed it, and then went through scripture and said, look at all these instances where people quaked in the power of the Lord. But again, the original names were Primitive Christianity Restored, Publishers of Truth, Friends of the Light. Religious Society of Friends didn't come around much later, but Quaker stuck. So he goes to prison, comes out 1652, has his experience with the Lichfield Cathedral, climbs Pendle Hill, has a vision of a great people to be gathered, and that led him right into some of these conventicles, these seekers groups, where people, were kindling ready for that fire. And from George Fox and some of those individual early friends, within a decade or two, there were 50,000 Quakers in England, and it was on. Of course, the Calvinists during the interregnum, Oliver Cromwell was not amused by all of this. There were an awful lot of debates between the Quakers and the Calvinists, especially around this notion that Christ dwelt within. One of my favorites was the Quaker and Calvinist Puritan debate about this. And the Calvinists said, it can't be true. Christ can't dwell within you. He had to have been at least 5'2". I think they missed the point. But there are all those kinds of debates. And another one of my favorites was a Quaker in earnest conversation with a Calvinist saying, I appeal to that of God within thee, thou child of the devil. They claim in most of their journals they won all the arguments, but I don't think that kind of dialogue always wins the day. All kinds of things happen. We've only got 10 minutes now for some questions, and I'm sure there's several. But with the restoration of Charles II coming back to the throne after his father had been executed by these rabble rousers, he's out to find out who killed my daddy. And so that's when the Quakers offered their peace testimony to Charles II, the harmless and innocent people called Quakers. And that is often referred to as the beginnings of our peace testimony, when it was really a political statement. We go to the king saying, we're not the ones who did in your daddy. We're the harmless and innocent people called Quakers. So, go after those other folk, not us. But 10 years earlier, George Fox had really articulated the peace testimony, because when he was in prison, he was offered early release if he would join the militia because of his charismatic leadership ability. And he said, I can't, because I live in the virtue and power of that life, which takes away the occasion for all war. It was the experience of that life and power that takes away the occasion for war. And he then quotes James and the lust of the flesh and all that kind of stuff. But when Charles II came back, came to the throne, he was still not amused by Quakers. He didn't go out and try to kill them. In fact, he ordered the end of execution of Quakers in Boston. They used to hang Quakers in Boston just for being Quaker. And he ordered the end of that, but also passed all these Quaker acts that you can go ahead and persecute them, whip them, and throw in prison and tear down their meeting houses they build any and forbid their worship, but just don't kill them. But the persecution simply further emboldened Quakers. But 1666 kind of brought an end to that. Again, this is an apocalyptic time. And all of a sudden, all the signs are not pointing to the coming of heaven on earth. The king has come back. The earthly king. Charles is back on the throne. That's not a good sign. Thought we had this kind of commonwealth, this interregnum with the religion ruling. And then here comes the king. Then there's the fire of London, which took out sinner and saint alike. Then the plague hit, took out sinner and saint alike. And that was one of the major reasons that that early Quaker fire, spiritual fire, kind of was tamped down, and a lot of that energy went into maintaining an organization. And we'll talk later on about how James Naylor's unfortunate incident in 1656 led to increased organization of Society of Friends. So it went from a spirit-led movement to an organization that sought, rather than transforming the whole world into their understanding of Christianity through Quakerism, to essentially a denomination that sought to improve the world by small degrees, which ain't the same as the early movement. So let me end there. We'll try to unpack all of this in the next 4 sessions, but we've got 10 minutes for some of your questions. So someone got to throw questions at me, or do I read the chat?
Let's have folks raise your hand, use the raise your hand feature in Zoom, and then we'll call on you and you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, sounds good.
Claire.
Yeah, thanks. I'll turn my camera on to ask this question. Hi, my last name is also Carter, so that's funny. Yeah.
Are we related?
I don't know. So
Are you from
anyway,
Brewsterville? If not, we're not.
no. My family is from Louisiana, so it's probably not. Common last name. Anyway, so my question is, so did the early Quakers believe that every time someone spoke up in, I'm not sure if they would call it like a meeting back then, but like that kind of gathering, that it was like genuinely God speaking through them every time? Like, how did they discern what was God and what was like just people
What a
talking?
great question. Because that's how they got organized, because they experienced that not everyone, I think, has given up their creature and their will and allowed God to speak through them. There's an awful lot of James Naylor coming through this, or somebody else. So eventually you get all these methods of discernment. One was the personal discernment. Before you spoke, you were supposed to discern yourself. Is this from God or from my own creature or my own will? Is this for now or for later? Is this for me or this group? And supposedly, if you go through all of those questions, meeting of course will be over and you don't have to speak. But there's the old story of a visitor to a Quaker meeting out in the Midwest sometime during the period of Quietism, when this was the style of worship, silent worship. And the visitor was sitting on the bench next to this elderly friend, and the bench started shaking, and he looked over and the man was visibly shaking and sweat pouring off his face and through his clothes, and he trembled and tried to get up and then sat back down, started trembling and shaking. And this went on for about 5 minutes, and the person never did speak. And at the end of worship, the rise of worship, the visitor asked, are you okay? What's the matter? He said, well, I wasn't completely sure it was God and not me. You know, that's the ideal. Now, how that worked out culturally was that eventually there were those who were recorded as clearly being vehicles for God's message. Elders, ministers, and architecturally, you built meeting houses with facing benches, often elevated, where the ministers and elders, those who'd been recorded in the minutes of the meeting as having a spiritual gift of, you know, we've experienced God speaking through them. So we've recorded this in our midst, and those were the people who were expected to speak. It was much rarer that anyone out there in the congregation spoke. If you read Alan Shay's autobiography, you get a great description of that quietist period where no one would speak unless they were recorded elder or minister, and the community had discerned whether they were a vehicle. So there are both of those ways of discernment. But that's an ongoing question because in a lot of contemporary Quaker meetings of a certain sort, when people stand up and their ministry begins with, as I heard on NPR this week, you kind of know that's not really God speaking. Maybe Nina Totenberg, but it ain't God. Great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Others? A Carter who escaped Rocheville. That is impressive.
Carl.
This is more of a future thing. I don't know if it's on the syllabus or not, but are you going to talk about a lot of the American divisions? Because living here in the Midwest, I don't think people think about that. And even it seems like on the East, nobody is very aware of what we deal with in the Midwest as far as Quaker meetings. And and in the West, it's kind of the same way. And I'm wondering, too, if you're going to touch on the progressive friends, because that part of our history is so forgotten, but it's something that really needs to be revived, and even some of those extracts put in our faith and practices.
Yeah, fourth session, and I'll try to articulate the Orthodox, Hicksite, Wilburite, Gurneyite, Uptographite, Waterite, Holiness, Odysite, Kingite, Conservative, all of that, through a slideshow of the evolution of Quaker meeting house architecture. Because that kind of shows it right there. And indeed, those of us in the Midwest and South especially know that if you have 5 Quakers in town, there'll be 6 meeting houses. We've had our divisions. And there again, Alan Jay's autobiography is excellent. Again, no show of hands, but if you've read Alan Jay's autobiography, you've seen his articulation of what those divisions meant. He lived through all of them in the 19th century. And one of his great comments in his autobiography said, when has a separation ever added one person to the kingdom of God or caused other people to say, oh, behold how these Christians love one another? But he lived through them all and said, ain't good. Yeah, we'll definitely look at that. I think there's time for another 1 or 2. We're getting close, and I'll hang out after 8 o'clock for others. And if you get my email, please feel free to fire off questions or comments or corrections. In an Amish sermon, I don't know if any of you ever been to an Amish worship service. There are 2 sermons in each worship service, and at the end of each one, the preacher asks, have I spoken truth? And is there anyone who would correct me of my error or add to what I have said? But welcome that as well. Any others? I had this effect on my classes at Guilford too. They were just beaten over the head into submission and silence. But I think it's also because I taught at 8:30 and they all slept.
Yuri.
Whitney's hands up too. And
Yeah,
Yuri.
yeah, let me turn on my camera here. So you mentioned this. I read this in the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice, and you mentioned something about it also just now, about when the Quakers were really like radical and challenging and such. That's when they grew exponentially, right? And then as that tamped down and they moved their energy into more organization, things quieted down. Can you speak more to that? It's sort of, I've read that before. It makes me uncomfortable, but I'm just interested in what you have to say.
Well, a lot of energy went into maintaining social boundary markers. And here again, if you look at contemporary Amish, it's kind of a distant mirror of early Quakers. All that energy went into organization and defining those social boundary markers. So that energy went into defining the height of gravestones, the width of lapels, the width of brims, the collar of clothing. Towards the end of her life, Margaret Fell looked at all this gray and black that people are wearing and saying, this is a silly, poor gospel. But a lot of energy went into that. And there was a period of about 150 years of that quietism where Quakers emphasized these social boundary markers to maintain this remnant, because they'd given up on transforming the world, and the energy went into maintaining a remnant. And yeah, we'll try to unpack a lot of that later on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Wendy. I think Wendy was the next.
Hi, yeah. I guess I'm in the wrong place, although I'm loving this very much. But I grew up Quaker and went to first day school, but then I lost touch. And and I don't know where to go for this, and maybe your reading list has this, but what I need to understand is the adult workings of Quakerism today. So they do things that I don't understand in my meeting now, because I missed that moving from like 14 years old to adulthood. So when they talk about eldering, or when they have meetings for discernment or things like that. And I'm hoping that some of this will also move into the way Quakerism functions today, or if someone can tell me where to go to understand my meeting and how the minutes are taken, what a minute is, things like that.
Okay.
That children just, we learned about Lucretia Mott and George Fox, but we sure didn't learn that eldering is not a good thing, that kind of stuff.
You learned the George Fox song in summer
Yes.
camp Quakerism.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah,
we
there's
did.
more to it than that. And we
Yes,
will
I bet.
get to that. One of the books on the list you'll get tomorrow that's really good in this is Michael Burkle's Silence and Witness. Just really excellent. Another really good one is Wilmer Cooper's A Living Faith. Those two are outstanding in articulating a lot of this. Next week, we're going to look at the social and spiritual testimonies, which will help unpack some of that. And then in our last session, our fifth session, we're going to look at contemporary Quakerism today and a lot of those things. Yeah. Thanks.
I saw Carter Nash had his hand up.
Yeah, Carter. There's just plethora of Carters around tonight.
But mine is my first name, not my last. And actually, my question was partially answered, or was answered, when you answered my meetings rising clerk's question. Thank you.
Okay.
That was Yuri.
Okay. Well, this is one of the things we'll explore. I mean, Quakers have a vocabulary that is impregnable to a lot of people. And it used to be that at Guilford College, we actually, to new faculty, staff, and students, handed out a 3-page glossary of Quaker terms that they would run into at Guilford that we just take for granted, but to outsiders or people new to a Quaker institution, just have to scratch their heads. Hold you in the light, walk in the light. That's an idea that wouldn't have occurred to me. Yearly meeting, quarterly meeting, what is this stuff? There are a lot of theological terms as well that we'll have to unpack.
Max, may I interrupt just a moment? This is
Sure.
Lee.
Hey.
I don't know how much help it will be, and I hesitate to toot my own horn, but,
The person who tooteth not his horn, the same shall not be tooted.
Right, our horn, it's a collective effort here at Fairfield. We took a clue from something we found online from a meeting in England, and shamefacedly took their title and expanded it, and I hope it's a living document that will help people. We call it the Quaker Jargon Buster. And it's
Right.
intended to serve that very purpose, to help people who are not familiar with our occasionally bizarre terms to figure out what's going on. It's on our website, Fairfield Friends Meeting. If you want your own PDF, we'll be glad to send it to you. I've made no effort to copyright it. It's freely distributable. The only thing I would ask is if you find something that's been omitted or could be improved, please let me know and we'll update it.
I found one on your own website this morning. I communicated to Phil. I was reading your history of the meeting, and it said, founded in 1826, we were compromised for many years by multi-generational families. And I said, I think you probably meant comprised, but maybe you meant compromised. Love it. Freudian slips, perhaps. I don't know if part of your jargon buster is a sheet that I've seen, some yearly meetings publish is 2 columns. When Quakers say this is what they mean. That's a good one too. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
I see a family member raising their hand. This can be trouble. Laurel or Catherine, whichever.
Hi,
Or maybe
Uncle
it's the
Max.
dog. Hey.
So you talked about the apocalyptic milieu that helped Quakerism kind of take off and grow, and mentioned that we are in a similar kind of environment now. Do you see signs of a Quaker resurgence because of that?
Possibly. Now, I'm old enough to have lived through several apocalyptic eras when attendance increased at certain meetings. The Vietnam War, and that was the 60s were apocalyptic. I mean, every pillar of society for some were being torn down. And there was quite an increase in attendance at Quaker meetings and participating in Quaker institutions, because of Quakers' anti-war stance or peace testimony. During the first Gulf War, 1990-91, there was an increase that I've witnessed, because there are a lot of people that this is it. The Quakers had this stance of, let's find another way of resolving this. And our meeting at New Garden increased. Then the Iraq War, the same thing. So it's possible, but the problem is our meetings used to be much more vital and dynamic. And so when people found their way to a Quaker meeting, they found something that spoke to their condition. I think seekers today would have a harder time. Now, they could flock to Fairfield. They might flock to New Garden. And there are other meetings, I'm sure, that they could find that which spoke to their condition. But as we'll explore later on, a lot of Quakerism has assimilated into the mainstream, and you won't find the same distinctives. I won't mention any meetings, but anyway, so we'll explore that. It has potential, and I think now, especially politically, culturally, socially, religiously, Quakers have a lot to offer if we can actually own our distinctives and offer them.
Thanks. And of course, some Quakers becoming good Presbyterians doesn't help either.
Well, it was foreordained.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great to see you. Catherine, what year are you in now? Junior?
I'm in my second semester of junior year, so I have 2 semesters left.
Catherine's a Gamecock down at the University of South Carolina. In the nursing program, highly competitive and selective nursing program. We're not supposed to exhibit pride as Quakers, but we're very humbly proud of Catherine.
Thank you.
Patty,
Well, I probably overextended my welcome here, but I throw myself on the mercy of the hosts.
if you have time for one more, we see
Sure.
Patty has her hand raised.
Sure.
Hi, I'm a member of South Seattle Friends Meeting, and actually I wanted to discuss the issue Quaker jargon a little further, because our meeting really tries not to use Quaker jargon. So instead of oversight committee, we have community spiritual life, and peace and social concerns is faith and action, and it goes on and on. They're all new names. However, I grew up Quaker, and I find comfort in using the original terms. And so I'm a little frustrated about it, but at the same time, we have members of meeting, often people of color, who really are very uncomfortable with the white Quaker jargon. And I'm wondering what other people think about that.
Yeah, good question. Again, Richard Foster talks about this some in his writings, that plain speaking, ought to be about communicating exactly what we mean, and not to use jargon. And I think we're at this is actually happening at Guilford College now, because Guilford, Southern Quaker school, was segregated until 1962. Now we have a Black president, we have a Black director of advancement, and the student body is 60% people of color. And people are having to learn a different culture, and different way of articulating things. So I think it's important to always reassess these things. But again, there'll always be people. This is why we had a conservative and an evangelical split among Quakers. There were those who wanted to maintain the unprogrammed, silent worship without hireling ministers and music and pre-planned sermons. And there are others who wanted this evangelical faith of sermons and vocal prayer and altar calls. And we split over that in many places. And there are those who want the 1929 Book of Common Prayer and those who want the revised version. So yeah, it's an excellent question. I hope maybe in some dialogue among other people on this, maybe it can be a chat room or something for people to share some of those ideas. I see Carter has his hand back up.
Yeah, I'm going to put my hand back up in response to that statement. As a person of color, a convinced Quaker, I was actually bothered when we got rid of the Overseers Committee. I understood why that term was offensive to some people, but I do like the Quaker jargon. And I'm sorry that earlier I referred to it as a question and not a query.
Well, there again, the jargon, we always had to explain to our students at Guilford that we actually had to pronounce it different, query, because when they heard query, they heard something else than question or query. So sometimes just how we pronounce it. Well, thank you all. I know that you'd only bargained for 1 hour, but I'm happy to hang out longer and also to receive any questions or corrections or further elucidation by emails until we gather again next week. Next week will be about the spiritual testimonies and the social testimonies and where they came from and how they are illustrated in the life of friends.
And that'll be the same bat time, same bat channel.
And same batty presenter.
7 p.m. next Thursday night.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Actually, the email said an hour and a half. No, the email said an hour and a half.
Oh, did it?
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to go another 15 minutes if people can stand it. But I'd seen on the website 1 hour. So who has the truth?
I'm just reading the email, what we got. So. Okay.
Yeah, I'm fine.
I'm the one that sent the email, and I said approximately 90 minutes. So go however you want.
Approximately. Okay. I'm sorry.
No, well, I'll hang out a little longer if there are people who aren't anxious to run off to Thursday night football.
So how do you know about Reba? That's my question as the Reba place person here. And I want to say I'm also in discernment over meeting membership in Philadelphia, early meeting membership, their membership at large. But I've been among friends for a while and traveled a little bit too. So I was IOIM's young adult outreach coordinator for the young adult friends there. So that had me travel. So I feel weird because I've been among friends so long, but I felt led to come here. So
yeah. Well, again, if people aren't familiar, Reba Place is an intentional community in Illinois somewhere, and has an Anabaptist background. I think, was it Brethren? Or Mennonite?
It was Brethren and Anabaptist at one point, but now it's pretty much turned more into Mennonite. Yeah, it's more Mennonite now. And also, if you were here during the 70s and the 80s, a lot of those kind of things have shifted too since then. So.
Okay. Well, I heard about Reba Place because one of the classes I used to teach at Guilford was on intentional communities. And I taught it to seniors who were about to leave an intentional community in which they had formed community and friendships, and there was a common culture, and they were about to go out into the world, and they were going to look for community. And so we were studying, the history of communities. We read Nordhoff's the Communistic Societies of America. We read Vanier, Art Gish. We read a lot of the theory of community, and then we studied contemporary communities and communities that succeeded, those that, like Reba Place, are still going, that have had their trials and tribulations. And one of the books we read was Tom Ham's God's Government Begun, about the intentional Quaker communities, the Hicksite communities of the Universal Society for Inquiry and Reform, which, similar to a lot of intentional communities, lasted about 2 years. For a whole variety of reasons, but Reba Place kept popping up in the literature of communities, and I'm glad you're still going.
Yeah, I'm not a member of the community proper, but I'm a member of one of their households, which are like mini communities now. Their oldest household, actually, the Clearing. So I'm the youngest member of the household. So.
Yeah, there have been some interesting Quaker experiments in community. Of course, the Universal Society of Inquiry and Reform in the 1840s was one of those. And just so typically Quaker, these were Hicksites. And they were progressive Hicksites, anti-slavery, women's rights, all of that kind of good stuff. And they formed these intentional communities in Ohio and Indiana. And one of their common beliefs was opposition to coercive authority, coercive government. And so, being good Quakers, they wouldn't be tainted by participation in any coercive government. So they wouldn't use the post office because it was a function of a coercive government. So they couldn't communicate with each other. So there's no way of getting information from community to community. And they couldn't force anybody to clean out the stalls or cook the meals because that was coercive. So, 2 years and they were done. But there was also the 1960s, early 1970s, a New Swarthmore community up in New York, which also had a very short lifespan because it turned out that it was just a hippie enclave. It was a good excuse to, fall into cultural patterns that weren't healthy. But there have been a few attempts, and among the more successful were the Georgist communities, the single tax communities of Bryn Gwynedd, Tangi, and Fairhope, Alabama. The whole town of Fairhope, Alabama was founded by Quakers as a Henry George single tax community out of the Quaker testimony of equality and simplicity and all that stuff. And it's from Fairhope, Alabama, primarily, that the Quaker community in Monteverde began in the early 1950s. So we can bore everybody with all this minutia, but maybe there may be other questions.
There was that Canadian group too, right? The Friends of Truth or whatever that was founded in Canada, and they have that beautiful meeting house that's still there. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Not to be confused with a group of mystics. I'm forgetting their name. It's heck getting old, but they came out of Russia, and Quakers from England saw them emerge in the 1800s and thought they very much like us, spirit-led and opposing the government, established church. They all left the persecution in Russia and eventually wound up in Canada. And their distinguishing characteristic, like many early Quakers, was whenever they were protesting some government act, they would strip naked and wander from town to town in opposition. The very apocalyptic sign, the end is in sight. Multiple ends were in sight. Yeah.
Max, I have to correct you that I wouldn't call me a sophomore, a hippie enclave, having been part of that whole process and the fact that I came through Young Friends in North America and our spiritual connections, which a lot of us still have with one another now. And I'd be glad to talk to you about it another time.
Okay. Yeah, I need to talk to you because my impressions came from Ben Richmond and Herb Wade.
Well, that's one small aspect. So.
Yeah, good. Well, I'd love to hear more about that because that is kind of the characteristic. Yeah. Thanks for
I just want to express my appreciation that Quakers are keeping their clothes on these days.
Yeah. Not always. Come to Guilford College on Serendipity Weekend, our spring bacchanalia, and they're not Quaker streakers, they're Quaker strollers. But yeah, early Quakers did. Solomon Eckles, quite famously after the breakup of the Bolenmouth meeting, I think it's 1663, stripped naked and put a basket of burning coals on his head and wandered the Smithfield streets for a couple hours. And Robert Barclay did it, and a bunch of others did it. And Solomon Eckles too. If you're not familiar with Solomon Eckles, fascinating character, early convert to Quakerism, famous musician. When he became a Quaker, he burned his violins. I think he took seriously the testimony of non-violins of Quakers. But that was actually repeated by a Quaker in Indiana in the mid 1800s. One of the people I knew at West Richmond Friends when we attended there in the 1970s, Eleanor Henley, her grandfather, when he became a Quaker, sold his violin to a neighbor, and then was so conscience stricken he had led someone else into sin that he bought the violin back and buried it. So, yeah.
Warren Hoskins, did you have a question?
Aside from struggling to unmute every time, I was wondering about because I really don't understand clearly the earliest Friends. How many were sort of agrarian, agriculture, countryside Friends, and how many were somehow urban? And then was there a recognized percentage who were highly literate, or were they more disposed to? I'm just trying to sense what the people were like.
Yeah, good question. And I think the best analysis of that is in Hugh Barber's book, The Quakers in Puritan England. He kind of has an analysis of people's vocations. And as they were referred to back then, they were rude mechanics. peasants, farmers, primarily from the Midlands and the northern counties. It was a while before Quakerism got down to London, because Quakerism began far from the seat of power. I mean, that's where nonconformists go, because you don't want the troops breaking into your worship and beating up on heads. But eventually it got down to London, and some of the lead, William Penn, Isaac Pennington, were, to the manor born, but primarily they were rude mechanics, agrarian, proletariat, and minimally educated. George Fox had a minimal education. Later on, you got people like Robert Barclay and William Penn who had highfalutin education. And Robert Barclay wrote his theological treatise in Latin first, then translated into English at the age of 27.
It does make me wonder also. I just recently was reading about the Quran, which I'd never read about before. Startled to learn that it's not organized in sequential chapters like telling stories, but instead maybe it just starts with the longest verse and they get shorter and shorter as they go back. But people rushed to write down as best they could recall what they heard from Muhammad's mouth.
Yeah.
And it was inspired and poetic.
Yeah. And in Islam, the understanding of Muhammad's revelation of the Quran as an illiterate, he couldn't read or write, is comparable to the Christian virgin birth. That this came through an untainted vessel. Yeah.
And so there's not really a parallel among Quakerism where you have the untainted vessels being recorded by the people who are literate.
Now, although there's a long tradition, especially during the Quietist period, of folk following around popular ministers like Joseph John Gurney or John Wilbur and copying down their messages. Because again, you got disowned if you spoke from notes or a manuscript. It was to be extemporaneous. And that lasted into the 1880s. There was a professor at Earlham College who was a member of East Main Street Friends, I think it was Erastus Test, who was censured for speaking from notes out of worship. But there were those who followed folk around and copied them because they just didn't want to miss anything these folks said. People don't do that to me. Although I understand this is all being recorded and may be used as evidence against me back home.
I see that Mary has a question.
Yes, I was just wondering, I think back in the, about maybe 1975 or something like that, I was in the library with my two small children, and they were reading, and I was just in the philosophy and religion area, and a book fell out, and I opened it up and I started reading it right there as it, honestly, I mean, it wasn't like I was trying to find something, but it was the Quaker Reader.
Oh. And
I thought, gosh, I don't know who the Quakers are now, but what they're saying, somehow the essence of it that I got, and I wasn't studying it, and I was reading it almost more like their diaries and their lives, and just very individual journey that they were on, and so I mean it's just really interesting that somehow a book like that made me very, very curious, and that I would even say to myself, well, I believe this.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was like, I don't know. And so the meetings that I've been in, often, not always, but the meeting that I started in was in Pullman, Washington, and it was a preparatory meeting. And so I think there's a journey for some people in Quaker process and the mysteries that that unfold or whatever, in terms of a learning about this process and how it you know, what it can awaken in meetings for business or meetings for worship or just any kind of gathering. I just think that there must be so many different ways that it all happens. You know, to me, you know, I've been very influenced by the meetings that I've been to, but also to the many people that I've read, or I've been in the Athens, Ohio meeting and with Helen and David Horn. And,
wow.
You know, they both passed, of course, but you know, that was really fun to be in that space. So it's just I don't know.
Lady Borton, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I wasn't there when she was there. You know, I mean, I heard about her. I always heard about her, but she was not there when I guess when I got there, she maybe was, I don't know, in India, or I'm not sure exactly where she was, but.
Well, thanks for that. Yeah, there were 3 Quaker books that are routinely listed in the top 25 classics of Christian devotion. George Fox's Journal is one, Thomas Kelly's Testament of Devotion, and John Woolman's Journal. And, you know, those continue to inspire folk when they read them. And I'm glad that book led you the way it did. There's the old story of the person who was seeking inspiration and felt that if you opened the Bible blindfolded and just found a passage God would speak, and opened the Bible, put his finger on the passage, and it said, and Judas went out and hanged himself. I said, well, not what I was looking for. Closed his eyes, shuffled the pages, opened it up again, put his finger on the passage, go thou and do likewise. So I'm glad you had a much better experience.
Very nice.
There was a comment in the chat that there's an online beliefnet.com where you can go online and find out what your religion is by answering a variety of questions. And one time at Guilford, we had a rabbi come from Israel and speak to the Jewish students on campus. And he came over, he didn't know it was a Quaker college at all. He's just been invited by Hillel. So he came over to the campus ministry and was chatting with me and said, does Guilford have a religious affiliation? I said, yeah, Quaker. He said, I went on beliefnet.com and I came out Quaker. But again, it was liberal Quaker. There are 2 that you can come out, Orthodox Quaker or liberal Quaker. And a lot of people come out liberal Quaker. Yeah. Good. Well, we've gone past 8:30 now, but again, I can hang out. Appreciate those who have dilly-dallied around, and happy. If there are any other questions or comments or offerings? Otherwise, we'll see you next Thursday for the spiritual and social testimonies of friends and how they get lived out.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.